So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us here today. My first question is, how does it feel to be in Kyiv at the moment in light of Ukraine's successes on the battlefield?
First of all, it feels like the place that I want to be right now because Ukraine is the center of the world at the current time for tragic reasons. But nevertheless, this is where the fate of Europe is being decided, and it's where the fate of some of the most fundamental principles of international law and international relations are being decided. So for somebody like myself who works in foreign policy, this is absolutely the best place that I can be at the current time professionally. You mentioned the battlefield successes, and I think that's something which adds. It's a source of great joy, of course. I can't say that I'm hugely surprised. We've
No?
seen I think we were all surprised at the stroke of genius that Ukraine has displayed in the way it has managed this counteroffensive in the last couple of weeks. I think military historians will write books about Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression in 2022. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is maybe one of the most brilliant examples of military tactics. So yes, so I mean, of course, this is a great source of joy, but it's obviously mixed with great sadness because we're now following the reports that are coming in of the absolutely mind-boggling acts of cruelty, of the crimes, of the human rights violations that the Russian Federation has systematically been committing on the territories that it's been occupying. And that is, of course, awful. I also think about the price that Ukrainian soldiers are paying for the liberation of Ukraine.
Have you traveled to Bucha, by the way?
I've been to Bucha, I've been to Borodyanka, I've been to Velika Dimirka, I've been to Kryvyi Rih, I've been to Dnipro, I've been to Kropyvnytsky, I've been to many places that have suffered both from Russian occupation and from Russian shelling, yes.
And what are your impressions? Was it like, how did that make you feel?
I hate getting that question because I can't think too much about how that stuff makes you feel because it's obviously quite painful. Also, I'm a foreigner. I'm working here. I think that question must most importantly be asked of Ukrainians, but it's obviously very painful. Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, so Sweden just had a general election, and it looks like the right-wing coalition may take the reins, with
Mhm.
once marginal Swedish Democrats becoming the second biggest party in your country.
Mm.
In your view, will the potential change of government affect Sweden's foreign policy, including its military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine?
Judging by the platforms of the political parties that have been elected to the Swedish parliament in the last election, I see no reason to believe that there will be any changes to Sweden's policy as regards Ukraine. The support for Ukraine is massive among all the political parties that Swedish citizens have elected into the parliament, and I see no reason to expect any particular changes.
That's
But
great.
of course, it remains to be seen.
Your country has been officially neutral for centuries, I believe. Now, however, it's on its way to join NATO, which many people in your country have been sort of wary of. Do you think it might affect the so-called, because Sweden likes to describe itself as a humanitarian superpower, and now that it's abandoning the neutrality principle, do you think that something will change in that respect? Perhaps undermine that kind of image?
I don't think so, and there's several reasons for that. Number one, you mentioned neutrality. Actually, Sweden abandoned neutrality decades ago.
Mhm.
There's a difference between being neutral and being militarily non-aligned. Sweden so far has not been a member of any military alliance, but that does not mean that Sweden is neutral. Sweden is a member of the European Union, has as one of the provisions of its treaties that no member state can abandon another member state in need, and that is a principle that Sweden cherishes very highly. Sweden is also a very adamant supporter of international law, of the United Nations Charter. We're a very strong supporter of the European Security Order, which says that borders cannot be changed by force and countries are free to choose their political orientation. And all of those principles are principles in the face of which Sweden is not and has not been neutral. So Sweden is not a neutral country. We haven't been a neutral country for decades, but it's true that we haven't been members of a military alliance. That will, of course, change now, assuming that all the member states of NATO ratify Sweden's accession. Then Sweden will become a member of NATO. And the reason for that is, of course, that through its outrageous violations of international law and through its criminal invasion of Ukraine, Russia has deteriorated the security environment in Europe to such an extent that it's necessary for Sweden to enter the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As far as the humanitarian question is concerned, no, I don't think for a moment that anything will change. NATO is an alliance which builds on respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And Sweden will continue to pursue those core values going forward. I'm pretty convinced of that. You mentioned humanitarian neutrality, and I think it's important to be quite specific about what we're referring to when we speak about neutrality. Sweden will always support the fundamental principles of humanitarian aid, and that is something which we can do irrespective whether we're a member of NATO or not. So I don't really think that there's any reason whatsoever to expect Sweden's standing as a humanitarian actor to be affected by membership in NATO.
Okay. I mean, let me just make an observation. You're like using very strong language right now towards Russia, but I would say that like it hasn't always been like that. So my feeling is because Russia's behavior in the Scandinavian region and Sweden in particular, even the Soviet times, it was quite provocative when their submarine got washed ashore in Karlskrona in 1981, and they also like kept violating your air and water space now and again, and they're trying to until recently, they tried dictating your foreign policy. Perhaps you have heard of Russia's ambassador to Sweden, Viktor Tatarintsev, who gave an interview to Aftonbladet where he was quite, vocal. My question is like, how come Sweden's response until the war in Ukraine has been somewhat soft towards Russia, or am I wrong here?
I think you're fundamentally wrong. First of all, what Russian government officials say in Swedish media is up to them. I mean, that's hardly anything which is a reflection on Swedish policies. I don't really see the relevance of the comments of Mr. Tatarintsev, but in any event, I think one can be absolutely certain that the comments of Russian government officials in Swedish media are pretty unlikely to affect Swedish policies, especially at the current time. Now, as far as our position is concerned, I would push back quite strongly on your suggestion that Sweden has been weak on Russia. On the contrary, I think Sweden belongs to the European countries which has been most principled in calling out Russian violations of international law. Those violations began actually long before the invasion of Georgia. They began by hybrid means. They began by attempts to meddle in the domestic politics of its neighbors, for instance, in Ukrainian elections in 2004. They began with economic warfare, such as the attempts at applying gas coercion against Ukraine. They have taken the form of supporting corruption and feeding corruption in their neighboring countries. Russian aggression has also taken the form of military threats, for instance, through its continued presence with its naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea. So, throughout the entire period of Russian coercive behavior against its neighbors, Sweden has been very strong in its opposition to that kind of behavior. And since when Russia then crossed the Rubicon in 2008, in August 2008, from applying its aggressive policies by non-military means to overtly applying its aggressive policies by military means through the unprovoked and illegal aggression and invasion of Georgia in 2008, Sweden has been among those European countries that has worked most forcefully to ensure that there are convincing sanctions against Russia. So I think I would not share your view that Sweden has been soft on Russia. I would say that the policies that Sweden has been pursuing as regards to Russia since it launched its war against Ukraine in 2014, and after it accelerated that war through a full-scale invasion against the entire territory of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, our policies have remained consistent.
Very good. Your PM, Magdalena Andersson, has stated that Stockholm will promote Ukraine's membership in NATO. Do you feel that Sweden views it as a sort of like moral obligation in light of how the situation is like unraveling and NATO's hesitance to give Ukraine a membership action plan, or simply grant membership like in Sweden's and Finland's case?
Until Sweden is a member of the North Atlantic Alliance, I am not in a position to comment on the policies of NATO. We can get back to that conversation once all the NATO allies have ratified our application for membership. I will say one thing: NATO has something called the open door policy, which means that it will not allow any country to dictate the terms on which it engages with future members. And I am pretty convinced that as an ally, Sweden will be strong in its defense of the open door policy.
That said, do you think Sweden would have filed its NATO membership hadn't it been for Finland's decision to do so?
Sweden makes its own foreign and security policy decisions, and the same goes for Finland. Now, I can't speculate about counterfactuals, so I won't be able to answer your question. But we take our own decisions. Finland takes their own decisions, but Finland is probably the country in the world which is closest to Sweden, not only politically, but in many other ways as well. We have an exceptionally trustful partnership with Finland. There are hardly any issues regarding foreign and security policy on which we do not communicate and coordinate very closely with our Finnish partners. But our decisions are our own, and Finland's decisions are their own.
Understood. Sweden has been one of the most active countries when it comes to supporting a host of reforms in Ukraine, including the decentralization reform, which is largely dubbed a success. Now that Ukraine received the EU candidate status, more reforms, real ones, not Ukrainian kind of reforms, let's put it that way, will be necessary. How is Stockholm willing to help Kyiv in that respect?
First of all, I'd like to know what you mean by real reforms, not Ukrainian reforms.
I would say that sometimes in Ukraine we have reforms that are a bit sham. Let's put it that way. Too little, too late. Kind of window dressing things. Let's put it like that diplomatically.
My perspective is somewhat different, to be frank. I've worked with this part of the world quite a lot during probably half of my professional career. And I have followed developments in Sweden's eastern neighborhood. And when I think back to the country that Ukraine was 30 years ago, and then I think back to the country that Ukraine was around the millennium shift in 2000, and then I think back to the country that Ukraine was during the Orange Revolution, and then I think back to the years of President Yanukovych and Prime Minister Tymoshenko. And I think back to President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Tymoshenko. And then I think back to the Yanukovych years. And then I think back to the Revolution of Dignity and the years under President Poroshenko. And then ultimately the last few years. What strikes me is not an absence of reforms. What strikes me is a country which has achieved huge reforms and huge transformations and done very, very much in an extremely unfavorable political environment. Unlike countries like Poland or Bulgaria or Romania, Ukraine didn't have the benefit of membership in the EU or NATO. And at the same time, Ukraine was the country which was more exposed than any other to the corrosive, aggressive policies of Russia. And in spite of this, this country has achieved huge improvements and developments in the last 30 years. So I actually wouldn't agree that Ukraine is a country which is bad at reforms. I would say that Ukraine is a country which has continuously been reforming throughout its 30 years of independence. Now, obviously, there are still many important reforms that I think it would be very valuable for Ukraine to undertake, and Sweden will continue to reform those, to support those reforms. And I sincerely hope that Ukraine's status as a candidate country to the European Union will also help to accelerate some of those reforms by providing a stronger political incentive for reform. So I think Ukraine is a country which has been reforming, which continues to reform, and which will hopefully reform even more going forward, and Sweden will remain supportive.
My question stemmed from the fact that there's quite a lot of critique. Even before the war, there was quite a lot of critique
Yeah.
when it comes to reforms, that they're too sluggish, that let's take the association agreement, for instance. I don't remember the exact percentage of completion, but it's not it's slightly sluggish, let's put it that way. That's where my question stemmed from. But I understand your perspective, and well, I would like to agree with it, and because it's flattering.
Look, I mean, if you know, obviously there are areas which can be frustrating, and I do think that, for instance, that there are some areas, notably rule of law, anti-corruption, where probably due to very strong vested interests, reforms are extremely difficult. So yes, I see the point. I do understand, and I think it's extremely important that Ukraine has a strong civil society and that Ukraine has free and independent media, such as the Kyiv Post or the Kyiv Independent or other media outlets, which make sure that there is transparency and that there is attention given not only to the successes but also to the problems when it comes to the reform policy. So I get it. Yeah, I mean it is frustrating sometimes. But I think it's also important, to push back against all the negativity against Ukraine. Sometimes it frustrates me to hear sort of tired cliches about Ukrainian corruption and the absence of reform and other things, not because they're necessarily untrue, but because they only show part of the picture.
The bad,
And I think it's really, really important to also show the other side. And as far as I'm concerned, Ukraine is definitely a glass which is half full, not half empty.
So let's talk about a bit about on a non-political note. Yeah, just quickie. Swedish culture has always been quite big in Ukraine, even in the Soviet times. Like all these Astrid Lindgren's books, for instance, Karlsson på taket, and yeah, I mean, I was a fan myself. I know what I'm talking about. And have you watched actually the Soviet cartoon? Have you seen it?
I think I've sort of seen snippets of it, yeah, but I haven't sort of properly watched it. No.
I don't think it matches the Swedish spirit of the character, but I'm not sure. But my point here is that it's like your culture has always been quite big in Ukraine, and now it seems that Ukrainians have become somewhat fascinated by all these Scandinavian concepts of living, like Danish hygge, Swedish lagom. Yeah, and I've seen several books translated on the subject, and people sharing and talking about it. Have you also noticed this? And like while living in Ukraine, this interest, rising interest in all these things.
Not really, no.
No.
I know that there's a cafe in near the Pechersk monastery, which is called Lagom, which is kind of sweet. I've had a coffee there once, but you're asking the wrong person, to be frank, because I think the whole concept is silly. I mean, lagom is just a word in Swedish, and it's a pretty uninspiring word because it means like not too much, not too little, ma ma, which I've never understood why that's such a great thing. And it certainly isn't a lifestyle, and it's not a philosophy, and it's not a religion. It's just a word. So maybe there's some smart PR guys who thought, hey, we can make a book out of this and add some nice pictures, and then we call it, Swedish lifestyle.